Mortality is kind of weird, frankly. You can't really forget about it, ever, but it's also hard to keep a clear eye on what it means for daily life. Welcome back to the 50/50 Project, where each week I talk through an item on a list made up of one thing I've learned for each year I've lived. This week, we're turning back to the conflict category. I feel like the conflict category and the communications category are really closely related to each other and both clearly aligned with my professional life. I work in strategic communications, and a lot of what we do at work ties into consensus building and conflict resolution. So a lot of what I've learned in life pulls from what I've learned in that particular profession. The last time I talked about conflict, back in episode 9, I think it was, I tried to sketch out a framework of some of the rules of fair fighting. But today, I want to turn to just one single sort of overarching principle about conflict and about relationships in general and about life writ large. This idea that I like to keep just on a low hum in the background of my day-to-day life. So here we go with thing number 18. Remember, we'll all be dead soon. So this is sort of dark, so I'll at least try to keep it short this week. I think this is very much on my mind right now because just a few days ago, it was the 15th anniversary of my father's death. He was such a good soul, and I miss him every day to this very day. And I'll have a lot more to say about him later in the year, but for now, I'll just say that this anniversary was a reminder of this truth, this sort of plank in my personal conflict and communications platform. So yeah, we'll all be dead, probably far, far sooner than we want to be, and sometimes way, way sooner than we or the people around us expect. And that's harrowing, and it's heartbreaking, and it's unpleasant to consider, but on my better days, it's also a real North Star that I can kind of follow on the path through human connection, and especially through the conflicts that arise from them. And while my dad's death anniversary made me think about this recently, it's actually probably my mother's death, which happened very suddenly, almost 40 years ago, when I was 11 years old, that first injected this principle into so many different aspects of my life. And I think primarily it has tempered me a little bit. I mean, mostly, most of the time and in most interactions. I am not by nature a very warm or gentle personality. There's just at core a lot of steely, kind of hard-edged stuff about me. And I think that if I had been left to my own inclinations all the way into adulthood, and if I had not had this lesson come to me in childhood, I wonder if I would have been even steelier and more hard-edged in some ways. I think that knowing from very early on that any given conversation might end up being your last ever with that specific person has mitigated some of the harsher things about me. And I think without that early understanding, I might have developed a conflict style that was sort of, I guess, scorched earth. Even now, I think I'm better than the average bear at thinking about crushing or hurtful things to say in a fraught moment. And unfortunately, there are times when that breaks through. There are times when I give in to those dark proclivities. But I also think I'm a little bit kinder and gentler and just better than I would be if I hadn't spent my whole life after the age of 11 sort of living in the shadow of this truth. If I hadn't known viscerally and directly for all of these years that we'll all be dead soon, and that often we get no warning. We can't put it on the calendar. We can't schedule a good goodbye. Sometimes it just strikes like lightning, just like it did for my mother, who was perfectly fine when I left for school on a beautiful November day in 1985, and who was then subsequently gone forever by the time I got back. And what that taught me is that you better be prepared at all times for what you've said to suddenly become the last thing you say to that particular person, in that particular relationship, or maybe flipping it all the way around to her perspective on that day in total. You know, there's a video that I've seen a couple times posted on social media. It's like a video skit in which a really elegantly dressed man is holding a cup of tea in a saucer, and he says something like, "I am really not as mean as I would like to be, and I wish more people would appreciate that." And I really feel that, like, deep in my soul, because I expend a tremendous amount of energy being not quite as mean as I would like to be, and it's really in service to this truth I know. And it can feel like sometimes people should maybe thank me for my service in that way, but, the main reason that I am, in fact, not quite as mean as I would like to be is that I do see the potential finality in almost every conversation, and I know that I might never get a do-over, so I better be mindful of what I'm communicating. Now, everybody knows this on some level, and everybody forgets this from time to time in the heat of the moment, and I forget it too. I forget it a lot. There are moments when I am exactly as mean as I want to be, and I just kind of roll the dice on whether I'll have the time and the opportunity to make amends later. By the way, my mom and I were on good terms when she passed. We'd had a good morning, we had a friendly goodbye that day, and behind all of that, we had a really strong relationship. But I've always felt a palpable, intense sense of relief that this was so. And I've always realized how devastating it might have been if our last morning had been different, if it had been conflicted or bitter or angry. Thank God it wasn't. So now, even in the throes of conflict, I try to remember that, and I try to leave a conversation in a way I could live with forever, possibly. Of course, as always, that's an imperfect effort on my part, and I screw that up as often probably as I get it right, but it is always in the back of my mind. And I will say that there's another side to this coin, and that is that we'll all be dead soon. So I'm not going to waste a lot of that time putting up with bullshit from people who don't recognize or care about that fact. That whispering, dim cognizance that time is limited and the clock is ticking. I mean, that also means that I don't want to waste my own finite, ever-diminishing time dealing with people who are unkind or thoughtless or draining or consistently problematic. So on one hand, I think it does make me behave somewhat more ethically toward the other most of the time. But on the other, it makes me expect ethical treatment from everybody else too, and it also makes me pretty impatient when I don't get that. Toward the end of the year, I'll have a lot to say about the hard lessons that loss has taught me and some of the strange gifts that early grief has brought me. But for now, I'll just say that I'm strangely grateful for this incredibly painful lesson. And I think it's helpful to all of us to stay just a little bit more attuned to the truth that we never know when we're doing something for the last time or when we're saying the final words in any given conversation. And I have benefited, I think, over the years from holding that in my mind, especially when I'm angry or wounded or stung. It's not a magic bullet. It's not a perfect fix. It hasn't made all of my conflict resolution smooth and altruistic and perfect. But I think it has kept me away from the interpersonal nuclear option at least a time or two. Okay, so that was heavy. And I think that's about enough of it for one day. I hope that your conversations today are ones that you could live with forever, but I also sincerely hope that you won't have to. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I'll be back next week with thing number 19. So, hi again. As I was wrapping up this episode, I remembered a poem that I wrote about 10 years ago that was exactly about the suddenness of my mother's death and the way it transfigured in just an instant how I see so many aspects of the world, almost making it an entirely different world in which to live and think and relate to others. And at the risk of being a bit self-indulgent, I just felt the urge to kind of tuck it into the end of this session. So this is called Meanwhile, and it's from 2014. A cold but bright November day. Through the windows there are all the usual lights and shadows. White light pooled on the fading grass and the sharp-edged shadow of our low, square school. Inside, we make all the customary noises of math class, our pencils rasping over worksheets in time to the metronome step of Mrs. Baker pacing the rows. Division, the reduction of fractions, the probability of overlapping events. I carry the one while across town my mother dies suddenly. From high on the pale blue wall, the classroom clock sounds out in soft staccato our final common minute. Each spent second its own lost world. 60 snapshot planets cut loose by some fading sun and thrown wide of the aphelion. Unaware, I round up from 5 as the newest old earth is cast off. Its people and its houses and its mountains and its seas falling away into mist and debris, falling fast out of all orbit.